Well, hello, I hope you are doing well today. Today is the second day in our series. It's Wednesday. Yesterday we looked at Mark chapter 8 where we saw Jesus' first prediction of his death. Today we're going to look at the next chapter, at chapter 9, where we see the second prediction. Before we look at that passage, I want to just mention kind of a couple things to you about the passage. As we saw yesterday, there is a definite structure that kind of moves through these, where Jesus makes a prediction, the disciples are confused, and then there's a corrective teaching, or Jesus teaches about that. We're going to see that today. But one thing I didn't mention yesterday that I want to make sure that you pick up on, that hopefully you did pick up on yesterday, and that you see today and tomorrow, is not only is that corrective teaching important, but the corrective teaching also begins to tell us a little bit about what it is to be a disciple. And so yesterday was the understanding, talking about that it is through giving of ourselves, it's through losing our own lives that we find life. And today we're going to see something very similar in that. So that's the first thing I want you to see as we walk into it. The second thing to understand looking at this passage is the idea that we have of children and the importance of children in our lives is a very modern concept compared to the New Testament times. In the New Testament, the people, especially the outside of the Jewish community, children were not regarded as real important. They were second-class citizens. They were not seen as really the investment in the future. They were seen more as a liability. And so they are very low on the understanding of who's important. And that's an important thing to see, because for us, our children are so important to us, and they're such a vital part of our lives that we lose some of what Jesus is saying in this passage sometimes when we think of children the way we think of children, which I think is the proper way, but it's not the way that they thought of children. So that's something to kind of consider as we look at this passage. But Mark chapter 9 says to us, it says, leaving that region, they traveled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there, for he wanted to spend some more time with his disciples and teach them. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead. They didn't understand what he was saying, however, and they were afraid to ask him what he meant. So there's our prediction, confusion. So then we move into the corrective teaching, or really the understanding of what it is to be a disciple that we see here. So verse 33. After they arrived at Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you discussing on the road?" But they didn't answer, because they had been arguing about which one of them was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12 disciples over to him, and said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else." Then he put a little child among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me." So this passage is one that speaks into that idea of children. And like I mentioned earlier, children were lower citizens. And one of the things that we see in Jesus' teaching multiple times, let's go back to, is the idea of parables. So we understand, so if I say to parables to most of you, you'll say, well, those are the stories, the Good Samaritan, which we'll talk about here in just a second, the prodigal son, the lost coin. These are parables, these are stories that Jesus told. But there's also what some theologians called an enacted parable, or a lived out parable. These aren't just stories that Jesus told, but they're actions that Jesus did to tell a deeper story. So one of the most famous of all the enacted parables would be the Last Supper, when Jesus washes the disciples' feet. He is living out that servanthood to them. That's an enacted parable. So we see that there. Here, most people would agree, is also an enacted parable. Him bringing this child among them and putting this child among them, and to say to them, and to use this child as an example, but to say to them, this is what it is to be a part of the kingdom of God. And as disciples, what he is saying to them and what he is saying to us is, if you want to know what it is to live in the kingdom, if you want to know what it is to be my disciple, to live in a cross-shaped relationship with me, then you look at the children. Not to become a children, not to be a child, but who are those in your life that everybody else looks over? Who are those people that no one else sees, or no one else is looking at, of how can I help out that person? How can I be someone to them? How can I walk alongside them? And Jesus is saying to them, that's what it is to be a disciple. It's to look for those. Now, this brings us into, it's kind of hard not to go into it, but to the idea or into the parable of the Good Samaritan. So in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we start off that parable with a great question. And a man comes, and it's in Luke chapter 10, a man comes to Jesus and he says, the man wanted to justify his actions. So he asked, verse 29, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? So then Jesus goes into the story of the Good Samaritan. There is a man who is beaten, who is left for dead. This person passes, this person passes. And then it's the Samaritan, the third person that comes, that brings him in, that takes care of him. Now, this is a parable that Jesus is teaching, but he's teaching us something else about the nature of who God is and the nature of who Christ is. And in this story, he ends it with this statement. Verse 36, now which of these three would you say was the neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Now, what is Jesus doing here? Jesus is moving from us asking the question and trying to define, well, then who is my neighbor? Who is the one that I help? Who are those people that are below me? And Jesus is saying it's not about defining who a neighbor is. Where life comes isn't in defining a neighbor, but looking for opportunities to be a neighbor. Looking for those opportunities for those people around us who need that help. That's part of what we get to do today as the church, is to be able to find ways to help. And that's the question that we have been asking. That's the question that leaders of our church have been asking, which is such an incredible question. Who are the people in our community right now in the midst of this pandemic who desperately need help, who need food? How can we do that? How can we help them? Who are the people that other people are looking over? And it's not just a question in the middle of a crisis. It's a question for every day. But a question to say, how do we reach out to them? How do we minister to them? Because that's what Christ does. The question isn't, who is my neighbor? The question is, how do I serve my neighbor? How do I find opportunities to be that neighbor? And today's prediction from Jesus reminds us, it's not about who's the greatest. It's about who's the least. May you have a blessed day.